Let's say it's that time of year again and you're considering doing some maintenance on your vehicle. One of the things you may be looking to do is checking your ignition wires and spark plugs. You're not sure if they need to be replaced. You may be wondering, well, what do I need to check? How do you check these things? Well, ignition wires, for example, are supposed to carry current from your distributor to the spark plugs, and they're supposed to have a particular amount of resistance, and you want to make sure that they have continuity. In other words, the ability to carry currents. You can look up the specifications for your ignition wires in your service manual, not your owner's manual that you get from the dealer. This is a service manual that the dealer does publish. It is, especially when it's new, it usually costs you a few $100s, though you may be able to get them on eBay for a good deal less than that, especially if your model is kind of old, say 5 years or older or something like that. Anyway, so you look up the specifications and you pull the ignition wires out. Now, before you do that, the first thing you want to do before you pull off your wires is check to see if there's any opens in the cables. Get yourself a bottle of water, spray bottle, and you want to do this with as little light around as possible. And I'm going to shut off the light in the camera for this. Spray the cables and check for sparks and arcing as you spray the cables. There's a little light now. I'm going to spray the cable, see if my cables spark at all. I don't see anything happening. The next thing to do to check the worthiness of these cables is run resistance tests on them, for which I'll have to pull them off the car. And now on to removing the spark plug wires. I would make sure I know what the names of each cylinder are, or at least know which cylinder goes to each spark plug and wire. So, for example, I've got my inline 92 accord, inline 4-cylinder 92 accord engine here, F22-1A, and this is the accessory side with the alternator and steering pump. And according to the service manual, this is cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4 with the ignition wires, and they all run over to the distributor cap, or to the distributor. This is the distributor cap here, and I can see that cylinder 1 runs, if I trace it down to here. Now, important to, as a way of remembering where it went, I'm going to use this boot here as a landmark. This wire here, this center boot, goes back to the ignition coil, which is an external separate piece on this car. And this is where I traced cylinder 1. You could mark it off somehow, or draw yourself a diagram of the distributor and wires. Here is cylinder number 2. And trace that. Goes over to this boot here. Mark it down, put it on your diagram. Cylinder 3. Down to the bottom of the distributor, and you could pretty much say by elimination the only one I haven't traced yet is here, number 4, but for purposes of good practice, going to trace this back, and it goes back to the 4th cylinder here, the only one I haven't traced yet and now have. So you want to keep that in mind. It'll make your life much easier for you when you want to put these wires back afterward. You can, of course, also check your service manual to see what the diagram of the distributor says, and you'll know which place to put your wires back onto. And for the record, since the distributor does have a rotor inside, a rotating mechanism that distributes the current from the ignition coil and sends it to each of the 4 cylinders as it goes around. So, according to what I've already said here, so this is cylinder 1, 3, 4, 2, and that is the firing order of the engine. And up here it looks like 1, 3, 4, 2. That's just for the record so that you know. And so now I'm going to pull these wires off, because I'm going to have to take them inside to the multimeter. I mean, you can do this outside if you want to. It's just that it's a little cold out here, and at least the tests, the specifications are given at 70 degrees, which is about the temperature inside a home. And I'm pulling everything off of the distributor, including the ignition coil wire. I did just drive this car, so I'll be running the resistance and continuity tests tomorrow morning after these ignition wires cool down. Of course, is as what it says up there on the top of my diagram, Honda F22A1 engine. But this is an example of how you could be able to create your own diagram for whatever engine type it is that you do have. So if you're standing in front of your car and you don't have a service manual on you or other official trusted source of information to let you know what are the names of your cylinders and where do they go to on your distributor, then you can make your own diagram of the car as it is before you go pulling any wires from it. So first thing I did was make a representation of my valve cover. I've got the numbers for each of the 4 cylinders. Cylinder number 1 is most towards the driver's side, and the numbers go up from there towards the passenger side. And I had a piece of paper out with me and checked where did this wire go, followed it. It went to the distributor. Over here I've got a representation of my distributor. This long line here represents the socket at which the ignition coil plugs into, and then there's the 4 sockets that the wires running from the engine plug into on the distributor. So cylinder number 1 had a wire running to here, uppermost to the side of the ignition, to the right side of the ignition coil socket. I labeled it 1 on a diagram, and did the same thing for each of the other 3 cylinders. So the cylinder number 2 ran over to here on the opposite side of the ignition coil socket, opposite of cylinder number 1. 3 ran to this bottommost socket of the distributor, and 4 went to the only socket that had not been labeled yet. And so this lets me know, which points on the distributor connect to which points on the engine. Okay, so now I have the ignition wires in the house. They've warmed up to room temperature, and I'm now going to conduct the resistance test on the cables. The service manual states no more than 25,000 ohms, which is 25 kilo ohms, or 2.5 mega ohms. I'm going to run a test on the longest cable now. I've clamped, this actually goes to the negative lead on the multimeter. I've clamped onto the ends here that goes into the distributor cap. And on the side that goes into the spark plug, I'm going to have to probe with the, pointy style probe of the meter, because you can't get you're not going to be able to get an alligator clip in there. So I'm going to turn on my meter to resistance. Currently states overload because there's infinite resistance when there's no connection. 2.6 kilo ohms. Well, that's right. That's actually 26,000 ohms and slightly out of specification. So I'm going to go take my meter to the auto parts store and see what the resistance on their longest brand new cable is, and I'm gonna make sure it's the longest one because I'm testing the longest one right now, and all other things being equal in a conductor, resistance goes up as length goes up. So 2.6. As you test each of your cables, you'll see that the resistance goes down for each one tested. Do the same test for each of your cables for however many cables you have, and you will know if you have any problems. Of course, if it states out of limits, OL, then, and you know you've got good contact on both ends of your cable, then you know you've got either a break in the cable or actually probably a break in the cable. If you're on the resistance mode of your multimeter and you get out of limits, you probably have a plain old break in the cable and it just doesn't conduct any currents at all. And again, if your meter is telling you out of limits or infinite resistance for one of your cables, and if it is in fact broken, then you will probably have noticed some pretty bad running of your engine recently, and probably notice also that if you do a power balance test on the car, meaning that you pull a spark plug boot out of one of your spark plugs, if it makes no difference in how the car runs, it's probably the cable with the problem. If you pull one of these off your spark plug boots or off your spark plugs and notice a decrease in the way the engine runs, that wire is probably fine. If you pull one of these out and it makes no difference or the least difference in how the car runs and it is already running poorly, then you've probably found a wire with a break in it. And you would confirm that with the multimeter and probably see an OL reading from that wire, while the other ones will probably give you at least some kind of reading. Even then, you want to know what the specification for your cables are, so that if you see that the resistance is just too high, it's still carrying current, but still too high, you can probably improve the way your vehicle runs by replacing those cables. Now, putting these ignition wires back on the car, you want to make sure you connect the correct points on the distributor back to the correct spark plug. Alright, so on the distributor, the points are 1, 3, 4, 2. So starting with number 1 and going to spark plug number 1. I've already got it set down on the spark plug side. Run the wire back to number 1 point, like so. There was something funny about this boot, that it actually pulled off without the rubber part at the bottom, so this got stuck down there. I'll have to deal with that later, figuring out how to get it out there when I want to get the spark plug out, but that also served as a clue to let me know that this particular wire went down into this particular spark plug well. So I'm pushing that back in, and this is cylinder number 3. Cylinder number 3 going to the point for the third cylinder on the distributor. So that's done. At least it doesn't feel like it can push on anymore. Now going for cylinder 2, which will connect to, let's see, 1, 3, 4, 2 up top. I think I'll do number 4 first, since it'll be harder to get to if I plug this one in up here first. So going for number 4, and that'll be from 4 to 4. It's the shortest, that'll be the shortest wire. Let's see. Here we go, number 4. This is really easy, really, on an inline 4 engine. Ideally, you would put some dielectric grease on each end of the wire. I did do that when I had initially installed the spark plugs recently. I'll probably do it again if I do decide to get new wires for the car. Last but not least, number 4, and actually it's not last, I'm going to have to do the distributor coil wire last. Now for number 2. 4, 2. Two, 3. That one popped down, or yeah, pushed down a little further, so that's why you check. And now the distributor coil wire. So each wire now in its runners, to make sure they stay in place, they don't come into contact with anything hot, get damaged. Obviously the valve cover does get hot, but this is where Honda installed the guards, and they've done fine sitting here like this. They're not in actual direct contact with the with any part of the engine. And that concludes spark plug wire installation minus application of dielectric grease at both ends of the wires. So I went to Autozone to check out the resistance on the longest wire of a brand new ignition wire set, and mine's testing at about 26 kiloohms and getting 13.4 kiloohms here on the brand new set. So I think I'm going to change my wires out and order some brand new NGKs. So I got my brand new NGK wire set because my old wire set is, or at least the longest wire, is testing over specification on resistance at about 28,000 ohms, and now checking the resistance on this brand new longest wire of the NGK set, and it is testing at, well, 6,600 ohms. So I guess that's a good case right there for getting new wires on the car. I'm going to also show the readings on the other wires. They should get to actually lower than this, as resistance on the wire will go down as the length of the conductor decreases. So that first wire was wire 1. This is wire 2. Testing lower, it is shorter, and as such the resistance goes down about 6,000 ohms, but just under. And that's wire 3. It's a different wire. Wire 4, clamped onto that boot there. It's wire 4, coming around here. Not labeled wire 5, it is the distributor coil wire. This wire here, coming around to this socket here for the distributor coil. Or excuse me, the ignition coil. So I checked out my ignition wires, noted that their resistances were out of spec and I needed new wires. I checked out my spark plugs, which were not going to look brand new, but still, upon reviewing the maintenance schedule according to the owner's manual for my car, it was time to replace the spark plugs. They're supposed to be replaced every 30,000 miles, and mine already had 36,000 miles. Which, by the way, my ignition wires, they're supposed to be checked every 60,000 miles, and yet at 36,000 miles they were already giving out of spec resistances. And as seen earlier, you can see that that brand new wires and OEM models from NGK were reading at most about 6 to 6,500 ohms or something like that. So I purchased new wires. They're ready to install, but I had to get new spark plugs first, so I bought new spark plugs, and now I'm running checks on the new spark plugs to make sure I'm not introducing a new problem into the car. And as well, I will also be checking the gap on these spark plugs, which I don't think are pre-gapped, and so I'll be demonstrating gapping of spark plugs as well. First off, I'm going to check resistance on the spark plug. I have an alligator clip already attached to the boot end of the spark plug. And let me get that a little more secure too. Okay, so I have the alligator clip attached to the boot end of the spark plug, and on the opposite end I'm going to touch the other lead to the firing electrode. First, I'm going to set my multimeter to the resistance setting to measure resistance. That's ohms right there, and check this for a reading. And even though this, according to several other videos, and I saw this demonstrated, this is supposed to produce a reading, it doesn't do that for this spark plug. And I also checked this, checked to see whether or not it's a problem with the meter by using this other meter here, which also does resistance, and I get the same thing. I do, however, get a reading if I short the firing electrode to the ground electrode, and then I get a reading that is pretty normal for a brand new spark plug. So I'm getting 5.4 thousand ohms, about 5,400 ohms resistance here, which is fine. NGK does, however, state that for this model, resistance should be 10,000 ohms. The next test I'm going to do is continuity between the threads and the grounds electrode, or sometimes called the grounding strap. This hook-shaped electrode that receives the spark from the firing electrode and sends that current back out actually to the engine block and back to the negative battery terminal. I'm just going to touch here. There's a metal piece inside here. that's going to ground back to, that should provide continuity back to the ground electrode, and there you go. So this spark plug tests good. You know, repeat for each of your other spark plugs if you want to check them each to make sure they're good. At this time, I'm going to comment on visual inspection of spark plugs. You will find a number of video or web page write-ups detailing what different engine conditions will do to your spark plugs. Different conditions can cause different appearances of your spark plugs, including a reddish color, a shiny, fuel-fouled spark plugs. There's a particular look for spark plugs whose engines experience detonation. There's worn spark plugs, in which case you'll just have you know, a really worn-down electrode. Dark carbon-fouled spark plugs. There's a look for pre-ignition and oil ash-fouled spark plugs, and then there's mechanical damage, which I'm not sure how anybody's going to pull that one off, but that would be the case where you can see that the ground electrode has been smashed in by the piston, and I'm pretty sure you would not need to take a look at your spark plug to realize that you have serious engine problems going on there. And in fact, each of these conditions have more prominent symptoms that can be noticed, such as, you know, bad idling, bad performance, bad acceleration, bad fuel economy, things that you'll notice sooner and more easily than having to pull a spark plug out of your engine. It may be useful to check for these things on a car you are considering to purchase. However, if you're considering checking the spark plugs on your own car this way, each of these conditions have more significant symptoms that show up sooner and are easier to notice than pulling out your spark plugs. These symptoms may include high or irregular idle, bad performance, or oil consumption. There are tests that can be run for each of the above-mentioned conditions to determine what problem the engine is having. So again, you don't really have to look at your spark plugs to notice these problems or diagnose them. You may want to consider checking the spark plugs on a car you are considering to purchase, but be aware that a seller can mask a spark plug damage by installing a cheap yet properly gapped set of spark plugs into the car. And this may alleviate some symptoms the car is having, but not entirely either. So let's start with spark plug cylinder number 1. So remove the boot. Get my breaker bar in there. Comes right out, it's easy. Spark plugs don't typically need a whole lot of torque. And out comes a spark plug. Still looks pretty good. Well, you know, it is pretty new. I don't think I'll be able to put a good demonstration up of how to check spark plugs, except to tell you that you may want to check them for to see if you're either burning rich or burning lean. If you're burning lean, it's going to be a pretty whitish color all around, especially probably on the threads, and you'll see it on the electrode. That won't be your only indication, though, that your car is burning lean, which can cause problems for your engine if you allow that to go on too long. But if you are burning lean, then you probably also have vacuum leaks and the associated symptoms as well, such as bad idling, maybe some misfires, and a more thorough discussion is the subject of another video. If you are burning rich, burning extra gasoline or oil, you'll probably see that the spark plugs are a dark, oily color. And I'm going to keep my plugs in their original configuration since they've already been used in this engine. And now that loose wire goes down to here. So this is the ignition coil wire up here, going out to the ignition coil, so using that as a landmark. It is the first point below that. It's the only one I'm taking out too, so again, I don't really need to know exactly where it went because there's only one place to put it on right now. And I'm grabbing my longest wire labeled number 1 according to the wire set. Got to put some grease on here first. Great to try to do this stuff with one hand. Pop that in there. Sometimes you feel a snap, which is nice, but sometimes you just push until it just doesn't seem like you can push any further. Run this through the runners and grease the spark plug as well. Now drop this grease spark plug back into the spark plug socket. Drop that back in the well. That went snug. Put the torque wrench on it. Plug torque specification for this engine is 13 foot-pounds. That's 156 inch-pounds. To get that, I went to the inch-pound side of the torque wrench. All right, so you can see it there. The bottom most mark is 120 inch-pounds, and on this this torque wrench, every marking, say for example from that 2 to the unnamed one, which is 3, that's 12 inch-pounds. And so if I was to have the 0 and center line there lined up at the level of 120, that would be 120 inch-pounds. So another 3 markings over at the third mark, where I've lined up the third mark with the center line, that's 156 inch-pounds, 13 foot-pounds. And that's what I'm going to apply to the spark plugs. And that's it. Click, it's done. Push the boot onto the spark plug, and the wire is now installed. Repeat another 4 times. Don't forget the ignition coil wire. Right there. You would think something like replacing spark plug wires is going to be very simple and quick, and it still is, but you can still get surprises. This portion of my third, or boot for the third cylinder, was stuck down in the well, and I needed to use my long nose pliers to dig this out of there. It took very little time, but yeah, sometimes you can get surprised by what can happen. I've also noted this before in my third cylinder, but the spark plugs that sit there tend to accumulate a lot of oil in the threads. As I'm looking at this right now, the electrode looks fine. It's dry. It's just the threads that have oil on them. Figuring the oil is probably coming from above, even though I don't see any oil on the upper portion of the spark plug. I guess a little. It's probably my spark plug seals. Need to get replaced. I have to do that again soon. It came to mind only when I'm getting to this ignition coil wire, and you should keep in mind for the other wires in this set as well, is that you should be examining each end of the wire to see, well, to see how intact they are. If you see that they look really burned out or something, you probably got some kind of problem to check into. I remember the first time, well, on a previous occasion when I was troubleshooting ignition starting problems with the car, that I pulled off this boot here, or the boot from this from a previous ignition wire, and I took a look at the ignition coil itself and found out that it was really burned out. I mean, I also had to remove the ignition coil to get a good look inside there to see what was going on. It was pretty burned out, and you know, I ran diagnostics on it, found that the ignition coil was bad, and replaced it accordingly. But when you're doing this kind of thing, you want to keep that in mind. Look at each end of the wire and look at the contact points of the component the wire is connecting into. All 5 wires are now replaced, the 4 cylinder wires and the ignition coil wires. I hope this video has helped you. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.